Great. Okay, well, thanks for having me. And yes, my name is Basil Iannone. I'm assistant professor in the School of Forest Fisheries and Geomatic Sciences in the University of Florida. And I'm going to talk today about a tool that I've worked with the Invasive Species Council on, the UF-IFAS Invasive Species Council on, for helping with educating stakeholders about the problem of invasive species and actually just the ecology and the biological processes leading up to invasion. The tool that I'm going to be presenting today has been published in the Journal of Extension, and also is a forthcoming document from the UF-IFAS's extension publications, the EDIS publications. And I am happy to share those with you. They're freely available. You can look for them online, but contact me if you cannot find them, and I'll make sure that you get copies of those. So, and first I want to acknowledge my co-authors on these documents. There's I think 10 other people besides myself that have helped write these documents, and I'm not going to read their names all out, but I also want to acknowledge the other members of the UF-IFAS Invasive Species Council, whose collectively the goal of the Invasive Species Council, which I'm sure Emily's probably introduced you to, is our goal is to enhance education of and knowledge regarding the management and control and spread of invasive species. And our research and extension programs span all taxa of invasive species. So what is the problem here? The problem that we're trying to address is too much jargon. Okay, there's just too many terms pertaining to invasive species and the processes leading to biological invasion. And I made this slide up in a couple minutes. I just thought of all the different terms that I could think of off the top of my head. I could get more if I thought about it and dug a little further. This just illustrates how many terms we have pertaining to invasion. The first line: non-native, exotic, foreign, alien, non-indigenous. Well, they all mean the same thing, right? Then we have native, indigenous, endemic. We have, I'll just go through established versus naturalized. If you get in the European literature about invasive species and plants, we have archeotypes and neophytes. We have weeds, pests, nuisance. The list goes on: native invader, invasive weed, invasive pest. Basically, there's too much jargon, and there's a lot of redundancy built into this jargon. A lot of people misinterpret what these terms mean. They use them incorrectly and just create general confusion. And this is not good for education. It's a barrier to education. And why does this matter? Well, this is the so what. Okay, this is a map showing shipping routes around the globe. And essentially, humans are a highly connected species through commercial trade. For better or worse, we are globally connected through trade. And with this movement, with species or human movement, we're bringing along a lot of species with us. And this is just a small sampling of some of the non-native and invasive species we have in Florida right now from all different continents of the world, excluding Antarctica. Of course, you have European starlings, we have pythons, different plants, kudzu. This is Lonicera japonica, Australian pine. We have Brazilian pepper tree, and we even have Nile crocodiles now that have been identified in Florida from Africa. So we have species from every continent here. And this continues, this influx continues. What this map shows is in blue, these are places where the United States have received plant material from historically. This is our historical plant source of material, ornamental plants. And the red and pink colors are countries where there are emerging markets. So we're getting new plant material from new countries. So what this shows us is, despite all the problems we have with invasive species and some of the ecological and environmental problems caused by introducing species from new locations, we continue to do so. We continue to introduce new species into the United States. So the problem is not really going away. So what we need is for everybody such as yourselves on the call who are working very hard to control and manage invasive species, Well, we need the public to really help us with this effort. Okay, it's not going to go away just with us. We need the public to help us. But in order for them to help us, they really need to understand, you know, the problem. What is the problem with invasive species? And if we went out to the average person on the street, chances are they might not even realize the implications and the environmental cost and the economic cost associated with biological invasions. And that's what we need people to understand better. That's why we need good resources or tools for education. Okay. So we do have academic frameworks for communicating invasive species for communication. Here's one that I actually like from Blackburn et al. 2011. And in this framework, they argue that for a species to become invasive, they have to overcome some barriers. First, there's a geographic one where they have to travel a large distance through human transport. They have to be growing somewhere where they're transported. They have to be able to survive. They have to be able to start reproducing and then disperse and then have environmental impacts. And depending on what barriers they overcome, then we can say, well, these are what we can call a species, right? And then it even introduces relevant management actions that you can take at each of these stages. And for each of these stages, in order to get from one to the next barrier, there's ecological processes that occur, and there's a list of them here, okay? Now, you can probably see what I'm getting at here. This is a great framework for scientists to communicate with one another and speak the same language, right? But when we start to get into this for the general public, it's still too complex for most people, okay? So what we were trying to do with the Invasive Species Council was come up with something that we wanted to come up with a standardized terminology that people who work with the public on invasive species could use and speak the same language to the different stakeholders that was concise and consistent. We wanted the words to be easily understood by non-scientists. We wanted it to be utility for stakeholder education, and we needed it to be applicable across all taxa. And the reason that's important is because there's a lot of terms that are very taxa specific, and we wanted to reduce the number of terms used. So we're not trying to resolve any academic scientific debate here. Again, we are really trying to come up with a tool that is useful for educating stakeholders. Okay, so what we did for this was a year-long discussion aimed at reaching a consensus. And I underlined the word consensus for a reason, because I'm going to come back to it and discuss what it means. And this was done with 36 scientists, extension specialists, and county agents whose expertise spanned all invasive taxas to ensure the broad applicability of the terms. But also I want to illustrate the importance of having county agents and also scientists involved in this effort, because what this shows is what we were trying to do is work across the kind of the chain line of information, or the pipeline of information, if you will. People who generate research and new findings, and those people who are on the ground really trying to communicate it to the stakeholders, the county agents. So that was important for this project. Okay, so consensus, what do I mean? Well, what it means is it's a decision that everyone can live with and support. It might not have been the decision that you would have chosen, but it's one that you can live with. And that's critical as we go through and we think about these words that we're going to present to you, because chances are everybody in the audience is going to go, oh, I would have chose this word, or what about that word? But it was something that we all came to an agreement with, that we can live with it, we can support it because it meets our objectives. And here are the 7 terms, and I'll go through each of these in turn. But we realized that what we came up with was 7 terms. We feel that these 7 terms can actually explain most situations pertaining to invasive species or those ecological and biological processes that lead up to invasion. They can be used across all taxa. We felt that they were easily understood, and they also encapsulated a more complex terminology that can confuse people. And I'll illustrate that as I go through and introduce these terms to you. Okay, so the first term was native. And this is specifically a species that occurs naturally in a specified geographic area. And that's important. It needs to be specific to a geographic area. We just can't say a species is native. We need to say it's native to some location. Okay, and then non-native is the opposite. It's a species that does not occur naturally to that geographic area. And we chose to use the word non-native instead of exotic. And this is because working with people who work with fish more than I do, I work with plants, they pointed out that exotic and also with other pets can often be perceived as fancy and not necessarily non-native. So we wanted to eliminate that confusion. So these are range maps of 3 different crocodilian species. We have the American alligator here. And what this shows is the native ranges of these 3 species, okay? So with again, it's important to say spatial context. So for example, the American alligator, we can say it's native to the United States, but more precisely, it's native to the southeastern United States. Whereas the American crocodile down here in the bottom, we would say, well, it's native to southern Florida, and the speckled caiman, it's native to northern South America and Central America. Now, just because something's non-native doesn't mean it has to be present in the location. So for example, kangaroos are non-native to Florida, but we don't see them bouncing around in the woods as we walk around, right? But nonetheless, so it doesn't mean that's not there. The next term we thought about was introduced. And these are species that are brought to a new geographic area intentionally or unintentionally by humans. And Florida has a lot of introduced species, okay? And these aren't always negative. In fact, we have a lot that really benefit our society economically. If you think about many of the horticultural plants that we've introduced into Florida that have increased beauty in, you know, residential and urban landscapes and gardens. And then certainly agriculture, it has benefited greatly and due to introduced species. So now the next term is established. And this is a species that has a self-sustaining and reproducing population, again, in a specified geographic area. And there is no need for human intervention. They're doing fine on their own. And here's just 2 of them, the tokay gecko and the scarlet ibis. Okay. Now, I want to illustrate a couple of things here. They're not always negative. These things don't always have to have a negative impact to be established, right? We have lots of established species that aren't having environmental or economic harm of any choice. Of course, we can argue that about these 2 species, but nonetheless, there's plenty that are not. Now, this is an example of where I want to illustrate what we mean by consensus. This was a point in this discussion where I was pretty adamant. I was like, no, we should be using naturalized. Ecologists understand naturalized as a term that means the species is there and it's established and it's doing fine on its own without human intervention. But this is why it was important to work across that pipeline of education from the researcher such as myself to the extension agent who actually interacts a lot more with stakeholders than I do. I interact with stakeholders, but not nearly as much. Because they said to me, and they made me realize, and others realize that, hey, you know, people on the ground, the stakeholders we deal with, think naturalized differently. Even though we understand it as being, you know, this term that in ecologists use, what they understand it as good, because the word natural is in there. That it creates confusion to them because they think all naturalized species are instantly good. So we wanted to avoid that, just use the word established. That's why we came to a consensus on that word. The 5th term that we realize is important is invasive. And a species to be invasive has 3 criteria. It needs to be non-native to an area of consideration. It needs to be introduced intentionally or unintentionally by humans, and it causes or is likely to cause environmental, economic, or human harm, okay? Now this follows Executive Order 13112, so it follows US code, and we also thought it was useful from a operational perspective in that it helps us to prioritize which established non-native species really need to be managed. As we pointed out, there are a lot of non-native species that are established in Florida, but we don't have the resources to control them all. So instead, we should really be focusing on those that have those environmental, economic, or harm to humans. So that helps with prioritization. So I just want to give, here's some examples of the many invasive species that are established in Florida, and everybody here knows these, but Florida is an invasive hotspot. Okay, that means we have more invasive species here than we would expect by random chance. Okay, and they have a wide variety of different impacts, and I just illustrate some of these You know, the lionfish is impacting our coral reefs, having ecological harm. Cane toads are, you know, negatively influencing and causing problems for pet owners. You know, of course, the python is, you know, detrimental to the ecosystem of the Everglades. We have Brazilian pepper tree causing environmental harm to our wetlands. We have termites, multiple species of invasive termites that are causing economic harm and cause harm to our infrastructure. And as an example of a species or a group of species that causes direct harm to humans, mosquitoes. We have introduced established non-native mosquitoes that act as disease vectors. So they're causing direct harm to humans. Now, one thing I want to point out that complicates this is impacts vary regionally and over time. And this can complicate the designation of invasive. And just to give a quick example is if we look up the IFAS assessment tool for determining whether or not a plant should be treated as an invasive or not, if we look at coconut palms, in the southern Florida, it is, this weed risk assessment tool classifies it as an invasive plant. Whereas if you look in Central Florida, it says it's cautionary. It means it hasn't met all the criteria to be considered invasive, but you should certainly probably not use it in your landscape because there's some caution to be raised. Whereas in the North, it's not. So this varies. Again, you know, whether or not something's invasive is spatially specific to an area. Now, regarding over time, this is a term that, this is a phenomenon that happens with invasive species across all taxa. It's invasional lag. What this figure shows is the number of counties that Chinese privet occurs in since its introduction in about 1880. And you can see it's not very many counties. And then all of a sudden something happens here in the 50s where it just explodes and it's all over the place. And now it's one of the most invasive shrubs in the forests of the southeastern US, okay? And this is, again, it's referred to as an invasional lag, that species is present in a system for a long time before it becomes very abundant and a problem. And what it really shows us is, as we think about whether or not we classify something as an invasive species, whether or not it meets those three criteria of being, you know, not from an area, non-native, introduced intentionally or unintentionally, and causing harm, we have to periodically reassess that. That's something we have to keep on in mind. Okay. The next species, the next term that we considered was the word nuisance. We thought this was a useful term. It describes an individual or group of individuals of a species that causes management issues or property damage or presents a threat to public safety or is an annoyance. Okay. Now, this cannot apply to an entire species. A species cannot be considered a nuisance, and I'll explain that in the next slide, what I mean by that. But it is certainly applicable to native and non-native species alike. That's what the utility of this word is. We can treat native species with some sort of, you can label them as something of management concern. Invasive species are certainly nuisances. They meet this definition. But this is an example of this word where we're able to reduce the amount of jargon, because it also encapsulates the word weed and pest. Weed and pest, weeds typically applied to a plant, pests are typically applied to invertebrates and also animals. So we can call all these things nuisance, relying on less terms. Here's an example, a couple examples. On the left, we have some species of grapevine, vitis, or however you pronounce the genus term, sorry. Okay, this is a native plant of Florida, okay, and growing in the correct location in the middle of a forest. Say it grows on one tree that's dying in the forest. Well, it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's not really being a nuisance there, right? But this species growing at a restoration site where you just planted a lot of seedlings and saplings and you're trying to get them to establish, and it's going to overtake and choke out and prevent light from getting to your valuable you know, seedlings that you're trying to get established. Well, now this has become a nuisance in that context, okay? Also, alligators, another example. You know, alligators are not a nuisance. We can't call alligators a nuisance species because that does not true. when they occur in their natural environment, they're not bothering anybody, they're doing just fine. But for example, if they keep occurring in places where there's human wildlife conflict, such as this golf course, then we can say this individual alligator is acting as a nuisance. So that's why we came up with this word. The last word that we thought was of utility was range change. And this is a species whose current or existing range, where it occurs naturally, is growing or shrinking or shifting over time. And this happens for native and non-native species alike, and it happens with or without help of humans. And the reason we came up with this term was for species like this. We have coyotes, we have armadillos, and we have mangroves, okay? They're moving into Florida, their ranges are changing. For example, mangroves are moving further north because of the less number of days of frost, whereas coyote and armadillos are moving into Florida due to population growth and other factors. But we can't call these species non-native, and we can't call them introduced, and we can't call them invasive, okay? It's because they haven't met those other criteria. They are not non-native, humans haven't introduced them, and if they're causing any sort of environmental or economic harm, it's context dependent, and we would label them a nuisance under that situation. So, but nonetheless, they are experiencing what we refer to as range change, and we'll expect to see a lot more of this as climate change in the future. So there it is. These are the 7 terms we came up with. We figured that they could explain most situations used across taxa. They're easily understood, and we thought they encapsulate more complex terminology. Now, we also came up with some terms that we thought we should not use, and we discussed these in these documents as well, and they're listed here. And I'll go through these in turn. The first term that we thought, we really should not use this anymore is native invasive. And in general, we know that this is being used to describe an individual or group of individuals of a native species that acts as a nuisance, right? There's sort of that grapevine, for example, or I've heard Biden's alba, which is a plant that can become very aggressive and take over an area as a native invasive. And the reason we're proposing not to use this term anymore is it really creates confusion, because an invasive species cannot be native, okay, by definition. And really, it confounds mechanisms, okay? Biological invasions are caused by humans who move species over large geographic areas, right? So species now are able to move distances that they would not have been able to move on their own. And that's really what is causing that environmental, ecological, and economic problems, is that sort of long distance movable by humans. Whereas these other species that can be aggressive under certain situations and cause management challenges, that's caused by different phenomena. So we argue that instead of that, we should be really utilizing and relying on the term nuisance. Now, the next term that we argue that we should not be using is invasive exotic. And we hear that used a lot. The committee members heard that used a lot. And the reason we want to shy away from this is because we feel that, well, it's used to describe an invasive species. Well, it's redundant and confusing, okay? It's just redundant. Invasive species are exotic by definition. And also it creates confusion because not all exotic species are invasive. Now you start talking to stakeholders and they're wondering, oh, it's exotic, it must be bad. Despite, again, most exotic species not really being problematic at all, right? And in fact, a lot of them benefiting us. So, and also, again, that exotic can be perceived as a different context, something fancy as opposed to something that's just not from a geographic area. So in this instance, we just say, keep it simple and call it invasive. It's an invasive species. Similarly, we have invasive weed. We've heard this used a lot, and it's used to describe an invasive plant. Now, weed is a cultural term, okay? It can apply to a native or a non-native species, and it just really means it's a plant that's not wanted in a given situation, okay? I have lots of weeds coming up in my garden. Okay, but some of them are native, some are non-native. And by using this, it may lead people to believe or think that when I say a weed, then I'm talking about an invasive plant. And we don't want that because, again, most weeds are very context specific. The weeds coming up in my garden are not really invasive. They're just annoying to me while I'm trying to make my garden do what I want it to do, right? And the same with like agriculture. A lot of those weeds, well, they're weeds that are unwanted in that given situation. Okay, so under that situation, again, just call it invasive. The last three words that we argue that we should avoid using to avoid confusion is alien, foreign, and non-indigenous. The reason we're arguing to not utilize these terms is because all three, well, they're all synonymous with non-native, right? They all mean the same thing as non-native. But we feel that as talking to stakeholders, these kind of also evoke political ideals. And, you know, based on your, for better or worse, based on your political belief system, they may actually imply negative connotations, despite, again, most non-native species that even those that are established or, you know, introduced and established in natural environments are not causing harm. So, and again, many non-native species are actually benefiting us greatly, such as agricultural species. So in order to avoid that sort of potential to have that sort of misconnotation, we argue just use the word non-native. It comes off, it seems to be accepted or interpreted a little more easily. Okay, so in summary, these are the terms that we came up with here, 7 terms that we feel that we can really utilize to educate stakeholders on about invasive species: non-native, native, introduced, established, invasive, nuisance, and range change. We feel it's a concise list. It can explain most situations pertaining to biological invasions or those processes leading up to invasions. And we feel it can be utilized as a standardized terminology that's broadly applicable across everybody who works with educating stakeholders about why we should be worrying about this issue. We feel that they're more easily understood than many of the other terms. They're applicable across taxa, limiting the need for more jargon. And I gave the example there, for example, where weed is used generally for plants and pests are used for invertebrates and insects. And, you know, now we can just call them a nuisance or something like that. Again, explains most situations. And we just feel they are of great utility for stakeholder education. So we do have evidence of utility, early utility here. And that's from the adoption by state and national level of this terminology. It's currently being incorporated into UF courses at the University of Florida. It's being incorporated into the Master Naturalist program. And it's also being incorporated into the Florida DEP trainings. It's being incorporated into extension projects or products coming out of Escambia and Polk counties. The University Minnesota Extension on invasive species are starting to adopt this terminology for their stakeholder educations, stakeholder education extension products, and then the North American Invasive Species Management Association is also adopting this terminology. Other evidence, bits of evidence that's of utility, this paper that I've introduced is being incorporated into an invasion course at Auburn as a strategy to, or a way to start discussing how to educate people better about invasive species and the problems that they create. And then we're also received some positive reception from extension and other land grant universities. And to be fair, in all honesty, we've also received some criticisms as well. And I'll leave that open for discussion, but the reason I'm presenting this is partly to introduce the utility of this tool, but I also want to hear ideas on how to improve it. We don't think this is, you know, we can make this an iterative process, I guess. The Invasive Species Council felt that way when we started developing this tool, that we wanted it to be, put it out there, let's start using it, and if sometime down the road people have some suggestions on how to improve it, let's do it. So. And lastly, this is the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants is starting to develop an infographic that we could utilize that illustrates these definitions in the context of plants that Floridians would be more familiar with. So, okay. So with that, I will just mention real quickly that since I have a couple minutes left here, the documents also include legal terms, what we mean by legal terms, and I won't get into that now, but we include this word noxious, that, so because inevitably, if you're dealing with stakeholders and talking about invasive species, you come into contact with these terms such as noxious, and you want to be able to provide stakeholders with a precise legal definition. It's a little different. We don't recommend trying to start people off with educating them on stakeholders about invasive species by starting with legal definitions. Not the place to start, but it's certainly something you should be aware of, that, and how, and I'm sure everybody on this call is probably aware of them. So we introduced the term noxious, injurious, prohibitive, conditional, and restricted, and what that means, so that people who are educating stakeholders also have that resource there to communicate what those terms mean. So with that, again, I'll just end that here. These 7 terms we came up with, we feel they can explain most situations, feel they can be used across taxa, we feel they're easily understood, and they encapsulate more complex terms that can often cause confusion. So with that, I'm welcome to any sort of questions, and hopefully no one has anything in the chat, because for some reason I can't see the chat while I'm doing this, so sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Basil. I believe I have the howling under control for the moment. Again, I apologize. The little supposed to be in camp.
I was just gonna say, they don't sound very sick. They sound pretty healthy.
I know, he's gonna feel better. But so we did have a question come to me in the chat box, so I'll read that. And then, yes, let's open it up for discussion. So Dexter asks, in the past, there has been articles in science and social science publications advocating the elimination of militaristic language in invasive species publications and our management plans. However, it seems to still be in use today. Do you know if eliminating language from invasive species management publications is still being discussed? And so I'm going to throw a link in the chat box to a research paper that that may be kind of one thing Dexter is referencing, and I'll just share really quickly. So some of this work has been done by Dr. Maisha Clark, who is now with UF and is on our Invasive Species Council. So Dexter noted in his comment, which he just sent to me, that this is kind of beyond the scope of what we discussed today, which is true. So today we really are focused on these key terms for using consistent language when educating stakeholders. But we have the discussions around what are the most meaningful messages for the public that will actually get them to act and respond in the ways that we are hoping is an important discussion that we are continuing to have. And it's kind of a bigger discussion, right? And it's part of that communication for social change. How do we frame the messages in ways that are the most receptive to the public? And so that's what this article that I linked to, that Dr. Clark spearheaded, showed that the public's perception with some of these languages being used, potentially was to the detriment of us getting our message across. So Basil, I'll let you comment on that as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was having technical difficulty. Can you still see my slides or no?
Yeah, I can. I think you stopped sharing for a minute. And then...
Okay, yeah, because I wanted to make sure I could move around a little bit without hogging up the tires. Yeah, the militaristic language. I'm sorry, I missed much of what you had said, Emily. So militaristic comments. I agree. I think it overshadows sort of the actual the ecology and the understanding of it. And, I also believe, the invasive, I think, is fine, because this is something, using the term invasive, I think, is fine. And the reason is because there is a lot of negative impacts of this species, right? But we need to make sure that we just clarify with people, saying something is native or non-native or introduced or established, is that really militaristic? I mean, that seems to me pretty neutral, but I do agree that we do need to think about that, so that not everyone's afraid of every non-native organism, you know what I mean? So, and regarding that though, I will add one other thing. One of the things that the debate that has occurred with regard to the militaristic language in the scientific community is it does take away from the scientific understanding. So for example, plant ecologists have been studying, for example, the movements of species and what sort of barriers they have to overcome to establish in a new community, and what happens when they establish in that community, what effects they have, right? Well, guess what? So have invasive plant biologists, right? But sometimes we end up not reading enough of each other's literature because we are focusing on only invasive plants versus those sort of ecology of just species movement and vice versa. So there is a little bit of a hindrance there that we've discussed in ecology. So there's that, I'll say that. So, but yeah.
Sarah asked, what an example of militaristic terminology might be. So the research that I'm familiar with through Dr. Clark and a few others is they were looking at how the media was portraying management of invasive species, and it was the use of terminology like, we're in a war against invasives and we're battling. And it was also like kind of fatalistic terminology in the sense of making it seem like an issue that we can't overcome. And so that potentially decreased the public's, desire to put in any effort, because if we present it in a way where it's like, well, we're overrun, there's nothing we can do, then we're not encouraged, it kind of disincentivizes the public. So I don't know, Dexter, if you had other research you were thinking of.
I would also say that I've seen some infographics like that as well, where they actually portray like invasive plants in a militaristic fashion or something. And I don't think that might have some negative implications that way as well. I've seen that as well, yeah.
Yeah, so it really is a big question of, how do we create outreach materials and talk to the public and the media in ways that makes them want to kind of do the things we would like them to do to help us, work on invasive species issues. Any other questions, comments about this?
Hey, Sarah. Sorry, I want to say hi to Sarah. I haven't seen her in a while. Anyway.
Hi, Basil. Also, while I have the mic, I just wanted to ask Basil if you would be interested in giving a similar, if not the same, presentation at our upcoming CISMA meeting. We have the agenda kind of squared away, but I do think if we could squeeze you in, it would be really well worth it to continue to spread this information to folks.
Yeah, I would love that. Send me what day and time and all that.
We'll do
it. Yeah, happy.
Awesome. Okay, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and, it looks like we have let me see. I see a hand raised. Does someone else have Bill?
Yes, ma'am. So I didn't catch, I apologize, I didn't catch the whole thing, but what occurs to me as we talk about removing the idea of an invasive native, as I think about cattail and Carolina willow, which will dominate a disrupted landscape, right? Like they'll come in and just take it over and they will not give ground, or I don't know how you say that in a non-military term, but will not off, whatever. So then you end up having to try to motivate your management to give you the resources to knock it back a little bit so that the other stuff can get a chance to, to come in once the nutrient levels have stabilized and things are starting to, settle down. And so I guess that those both would qualify perhaps as a nuisance species in the context that we're talking about, restoring wetlands from ag, for instance. What are your thoughts about how we would kind of like try to make that a compelling case for our management?
Well, no, I thank you for bringing it up. And there's, of course, this term I think raised a lot of conversation, right? Because of the examples you just provided are perfect examples of why people call something a native invasive, right? But I just want to reiterate again, it kind of mixes apples and oranges, because an invasive species, biological invasions are caused by people moving things over large distances, right? things that would have probably had a better chance of going, like if you think about rabbits in Australia or some of the other things that have moved across continents, they probably would have had a better, more likelihood of going extinct than ever reaching that location, right? So, you know, so it's a very different mechanism by which the environmental impact or the economic or ecological impact occurs. It's through human process of large travel distance. So whereas the cattail problem that you're discussing is, right? I mean, cattails are native to Florida, but under certain situations, they can become a bully in the system, right? So they can become very aggressive and they can cause very real management issues, but it's not because humans have moved them from, you know, a European strain. Do you know what I mean? So it's a different thing. That's why we were very, we really wanted to eliminate that term. And I think, you know, the compelling argument is just the challenges you have, right? So again, a cattail establishing in a well-established wetland probably is fine, but you know, in a newly restored wetland that you're trying to convert from agricultural areas, it's certainly not okay, because it's going to put your system in a state of, you know, static state where of cattail domination that you don't want. So I would just argue that you use terms such as that describe its characteristic, you know, given the certain situation that it has to be controlled that way. Called it's a nuisance. It would, in that instance, we would just refer to it as a nuisance. Again, a cattail, not all cattails are, not the entire species of cattails are not nuisances, right? But they are in that situation.
Yeah, I like what you say about, you know, kind of calling it a bully or dominant species, because that's, you know, you're talking about a disrupted landscape. So it's still an anthropogenic feature, right? Where we've kind of re-landscaped it. And then these plants like the Carolina willow and the cattail will kind of maintain it the way they want it, right? They actually have some impact and influence on the landscape to the point where they won't give ground unless you push them back. And so,
yeah, at the University of Minnesota, when I was working on wetland restorations up there was, you know, you couldn't identify if it was the native cattail, the hybrid cattail or not until it was flowering. And then by that time it was too late. So they would just, you know, control all cattails initially at the early stages of a wetland restoration. So, yeah.
Thanks for addressing that. Yeah.
Sure. No, it's great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, great discussion. Thanks. So I do have some updates. So I'm going to, sorry there, Basil, I'm going to boot you off there.
That's fine.
But yeah, anyone, you know, if you want to chat with us more, you know, just get in touch. I'm trying to get this into presentation mode here. So yeah, so I just have a few general CISMA and FISP updates. I want to give a shout out to Southwest Florida CISMA. Last week, they did a really cool event. They did a bio blitz at Rattlesnake Hammock Preserve. And they kind of helped that site confirm the invasive species present, as well as identifying some previously unknown infestations to help the staff kind of prioritize their work. So I thought that was really cool. And I just wanted to give them a shout out for that. Some upcoming events. Heartland CISMA has an awesome summer webinar series going on. And so they actually had one today. They have one today, right this afternoon after this webinar. So check that out. And then also on July 28th and August 25th. Coming up at 4, thanks, Cheryl. The Everglades Invasive Species Virtual Summit is scheduled for July 21st. And when I get links and more information on how to register, we'll get that out to you guys. The Aquatic Weed Control short course is coming up, will be August 16th through 19th. I'm looking forward to that. FISP will be there. We'll have a table. It'll be our first post-COVID public event. So looking forward to seeing some of you folks again. And then on September 1st through 2nd, the Florida Invasive Species Symposium, virtual symposium. This is a partnership between the Florida Invasive Species Council, formerly FLEPSI, and ourselves, FISP, to kind of host. It's been a while since FISC has gotten together due to COVID, and so we just wanted to do something to. Quiet now. Thank you. We just wanted to do something to get everyone back together. So we got a great workshop coming together. We're going to focus on herbicides, prevention, and horizon scanning and biological control. And actually, I have some links for that. but I can't see them because of my screen. So I'll get those up in the chat box, some additional information. But as always, you can check out our calendar online. Join us for our CISMA call next month. We've got Laurel Wilt updates for Florida and the Southeast with Jeffrey Eichhorn. This was rescheduled from last month, where we unfortunately had a last minute issue with our speaker, and so he will be with us next month, and looking forward to that. As always, if you see a presentation or have a topic you'd like to hear about on these calls, let me know. I'll be actually starting to work on the 2022 schedule before we know it. And then lastly, I wanted to share a quick note about past calls. We usually get a few questions about how to find past calls so that you can see the recordings. So these are recorded. We have moved our platform from them being uploaded into Bugwood and shared via that link to our FISP YouTube channel. And this just really streamlines the process for getting them up. So as opposed to taking a week, I'll be able to pop those videos up the day of, or at the latest the next day. So this call will go up, if not this afternoon, definitely tomorrow. And so there is that link there. But again, I'll pop these links into the chat box. And then lastly, as always, please follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And let us know how we can help amplify your content as well.